There is an art form long lost in modern cinema, a cinematic philosophy that has been left abandoned and forgotten. That is until Dune. Dune is a once-in-a-century cinematic achievement. With Dune, Denis hasn't just resurrected an art form, he's perfected that art form and elevated it to reach an almost insurmountable zenith. Dune isn't just a film, it's a revolution, it's a manifesto that demands your attention. Poised to redefine the future of sci-fi and cinema as a whole. But what is this lost art that Denis so masterfully employs? It is silence. With every sound, every word, silence! And every frame, Dune embraces the power of silence. How does Dune orchestrate such an auditory masterpiece that remains so quietly restrained, whilst enabling each note to strike with such incredible magnitude? Dune achieves this by employing 3 distinct techniques: transmutation, selective isolation, and layered repetition. Transmutation is an extremely powerful audio technique that Dune deftly employs to allow each sound to carry such brilliant expressiveness. We see this technique used in the very opening of Dune Part 2. We hear this thumping of the wormhole come in. As the Harkonnen soldiers ascend this rock face, the thumping of the wormhole re-emerges. It integrates into the score, now expressing both the soldiers' contact with the rock face and their heartbeats. It appears just like part of the music. It's only until this soldier peers through his scope. Then the sound unveils its true form. The Fremen leap through the sand in front of an incoming spice harvester. The tremor of its blade seamlessly transmutes into a drumming adrenaline beat. Even the running forms as though emerging from the music. This hydraulic sound of the harvester transforms into this tense synthetic rhythm section. The marching sound of the Harkonnens going to war mutates into a drum-like war anthem. The fireworks celebrating Feyd-Rautha's victory transform into this dark, mysterious ambiance.
You're following me.
Am I?
During the final battle scene, this thumper suddenly shifts to function as a war drum as the Fremen army comes into view. Sound flows into music. Music flows into sound. This is how Dune transmutes audio, by freely allowing sound and music to ebb and flow. Through transmutation, Dune recycles its quietly restrained library of sound, efficiently maximizing every note, enabling every sound to carry the power of a multitude. Dune utilizes selective isolation to make every sound significant, to make every note ring out with stark clarity. We see that so beautifully executed when we hear Richard King's signature reverberation. As these Harkonnen soldiers jetpack upwards, no sound of footsteps on the sand, no sound of a jetpack, only music. There are no machine sounds in this scene, just the muted sounds of Charlie's footsteps, allowing the explosion of this ornithopter to burst out so profoundly. This technique is also used for large elements like the entrance of this ship on Caladan and the Emperor's ship too, and most memorably for when the giant sandworm bursts out from the sandstorm to loom over the Sadaka. Similarly true when Baron Harkonnen emerges in the arena booth on Guide Prime, and when Feyd-Rautha strides across the arena. Scenes which rely on quieting sound to allow music to rush out, enabling some of the most exceptional audio moments ever put to film. Even with hundreds of elements on screen, King limits his soundscape to only what is centralized, isolating the main subject. When Chani fights in the final battle, we only hear her cutting down soldiers. The same is true of Gurney Halleck fighting his way to Raban. And in the final battle sequence between Paul and Fade Ratha, the only sounds become these clashing blades, providing such a powerful intensity to the moment, delivering one of the most intense fight sequences ever put to film. Practically every scene in Dune embraces this methodology, select sounds being brought to the forefront, whilst silencing everything else. This use of selective isolation enables each captured element to dominate. Which enables Dune's soundscape to convey this impeccable feeling of closeness and immediacy. Dune so powerfully relies on layering repeated sounds that prime and ingrain us with emotions that are then brilliantly manipulated. Dune acclimatizes us to the sound of the thumpers through the sound's repeated and continued instillment. Contextually, it not only informs us of the arrival of a sandworm, but emotes a looming threat, an impending danger, and a disturbance to the natural order. Initially, it sounds like the beating heart of the desert itself. But as the Fremen progress in their conquest of the Harkonnens, it gains this added artificiality, later resembling nothing more than an industrial hydraulic pump. Hinting at the Fremen's disconnect from their harmonious union with the desert. We are also primed to this spiritual harm. In the Cavern of Souls, it connotes a ritualistic death. When it is then used for the Water of Life, it carries those undertones, suggesting a dark and foreboding nature to Jessica and Paul's transformation. Music is also manipulated in this manner. The triumphant spiritual overture of the Fremen is repeated and progressively evolved throughout the film. It primes us for a spiritual triumph of nature over dark industrialism. It is utilised when Paul destroys the spice harvester, and again when Paul rides the sandworm, and when the Fremen ride out for the final assault on the Harkonnen base. However, the more tribalistic vocals of the soundtrack diminish throughout each scene, connoting again the Fremen's greater separation from their inner nature. Even the Harkonnens are signatured by their own brand of dark reverberation that modulates and shifts. It reaches its highest peak when we are introduced to Fade Ratha, hinting at his potential power and future supremacy. The Harkonnens' dark tones are then intermixed with the Fremen's overture. This scene with Paul ascending the plateau after his transformation incorporates both characteristics, informing us of Paul's now darker nature. Dune focuses on reusing a considered library of sound rather than drowning the viewer in meaningless notes. Through this, Dune primes us with emotional expectations, which are then expertly manipulated to silently communicate thematic arcs. This familiar soundscape deeply imbues us with the language of Dune's world and powerfully and memorably roots us in its universe. All of these elements work in unison to deliver one of the most exceptional auditory experiences I've ever witnessed on film. It's the pinnacle example of doing more with less. Having one sound perform the work of many, dialing down other noises to accentuate the most important. Recycling audio rather than discarding it, and it's completely in opposition of the mainstream approach of diluting the soundscape with as much noise as possible. Dune's approach to sound design is an austere auditory sensation, a sonic salve in an arena filled with migraine-inducing media. How can you teach somebody the language of a world with so few words? How can you impart the soul of a character without communication? Let's begin this exploration by analysing how Dune accomplishes this through its use of minimal exposition. Dune's use of minimalist exposition is perhaps the most refreshing respect to audiences' intelligence I've witnessed in a blockbuster movie for almost 3 decades. Denis' approach becomes so much more apparent when you compare it to Lynch's directorial approach in his adaptation of Dune. Lynch chooses to spend an entire 4 minutes on clunky exposition.
Know then that it is the year 10,191. The known universe is ruled by the Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV, my father.
Whereas here we are provided a quiet entry into Dune's world, allowed to gain knowledge through characters, events, and actions. The only real overt exposition is this small part about Dune and the significance of spice. We learn of the sandworms and the Fremen sandwalking technique. Everything else about the world we're left to figure out through inference. We see a great example of this when Paul is commanded to use the voice. At no point are we ever told what the voice is.
Give me the water.
We are never explicitly informed of the Fremen's conservation and sacred cherishment of water. This Fremen man merely mentions to Paul that these trees are sacred due to the amount of water they consume, and we can extrapolate through their design of the stillsuits, and because Stilgar spits as a form of respectful greeting. When we see the shield technology used for the first time, we are given a visual walkthrough of how it operates. But the best, most evidential examples of minimal exposition are present in Dune Part 2, especially because it had 2 huge challenges to compensate for. People who hadn't seen Part 1, and the huge 3-year gulf between Part 1 and Part 2. Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, The Hobbit and the Hunger Games Mockingjay. All of these films had their adjoining counterpart released within a year. Dune is the only one that had a 3-year gulf between its first and second installment. Any other director would resort to excessive exposition to try to bridge this gap.
Summon a meeting of the 7 dwarf families. Demand they stand by their oaths.
The 7 armies swore that oath to the one who wields the king's jewel, the Arkenstone. It is the only thing that will unite them, and in case you have forgotten, that jewel was stolen by Smaug.
But Denis doesn't. In Part 2, we are only given this brief opening. We are only told of the fall of House Atreides at the hands of the Harkonnens. We are not told of who Paul is. We are not told of who Lady Jessica is. We don't get told this is Baron Harkonnen and what his significance is to the plot, or why spice is such a valuable resource. We are also never reintroduced to the Bene Gesserit or reinformed of their abilities. Paul later has this vision where Jameis is Paul's mentor, instructing Paul that he must go south despite his reservations. It's a scene that relies on knowing about Paul's earlier visions of Jameis from the first film, and the knowledge that Paul's visions seem to show events from possible futures. It's a lack of hand-holding that is so utterly refreshing. Dune is a masterwork in visual storytelling, whole scenes that allow us to soak in the world of Dune, to immerse ourselves in each scene and gain greater insight through potent symbolism. One such example of this storytelling is seen with the continued imagery of a matador and bull. It so brilliantly foreshadows the trap set for House Atreides on Arrakis, representing Leto being lured as a trick, toyed with in a ploy orchestrated by the Emperor. Made more ominous by the fact we see Leto observing that very symbol as he visits his father's gravesite, hinting at a similar fate. It also acts to symbolize how Leto will be trapped by his allegiance to tradition, honoring his family's legacy in his act to answer the Emperor's beckon, the very thing that will spell his demise. The Atreides ring is another powerful visual conveyance. We see Paul hide his hand over the ring in this scene, referencing the extinction of the Atreides household, but also his current concealment and uncertainty of his legacy. Later, after Paul kisses Charlie and makes his commitment to become Fremen, he pockets the ring, reflecting his abandonment of his legacy. It is when Paul reunites with Gurney Halleck that we see him toying with the ring, questioning his path as Gurney unburies his history and reignites his prior motivations for revenge. In this final scene when Paul puts on the ring, it not only shows his ascension to his rightful legacy, but signifies he has made his final choice, choosing to become Paul Atreides over Muad'Dib. Chani's ribbon is also a beautiful symbolism. It symbolizes love in Fremen culture. We can see Chani adorn it here after they fall in love, but in the final scene, Chani reties the band around her arm, now suggesting her love has been put aside. Chani wears it like a black armband, symbolizing her mourning of their lost relationship. There are also whole sections in Dune where Denis relies entirely on visual storytelling. The scene with Paul taming the grandfather worm is an entirely silent sequence. Rather than having Stilgar or the Fremen explain the process, we are simply shown the art of sandwriting. We see how lifting these flaps on the worm exposes these areas it breathes from, causing it to surface, allowing it to be tamed and controlled. When Lady Margot coaxes Feyd-Rautha into her room, the entire sequence is silent, but we can see through composition that despite Margot's lower framing, she is dominant. In one purely visual sequence, we are informed of Feyd-Rautha's vulnerability and, more importantly, Margot's power, easily able to subvert and manipulate such an otherwise dangerous individual. Another example of this approach is this scene involving the Maker-Keeper. We are given 3 minutes of complete silence, free to observe ourselves the technique of the extraction process. Very few directors today would have entirely silent sequences in an epic sci-fi film. It so clearly illustrates Denis' respect for the craft of cinema and mastery of visual storytelling. Dune is a monumental testament on the art of silently communicating characters, whole scenes carried purely by expression. Each look revealing a kaleidoscope of emotions. With Jessica, we see how conflicted she is in her obligation to her order, but also the clear love she has for her son. When Paul is forced to participate in Mohiam's test, is she restraining herself, ready to absolve the Bene Gesserit and stop Mohiam? Or is she steeling her fears and emotions, aware of what needs to be done? Here, Jessica walks with the Order as Mohiam departs Arrakeen. Is she simply hurt by the fact her son was used as a pawn in the Bene Gesserit's will? Is she pained by her own involvement? Is she mournful of her betrayal and failure to her Order? Here, when Paul is haunted by visions of his future, is she just pained by her son feeling like he is a freak? Is she expressing deep guilt at her complicity towards his condition? When Paul survives the water of life, is she awed by her fulfillment of the Bene Gesserit will? Or is she paralyzed with fear of what she may have turned her son into? Not a single line is uttered to answer these questions. We are left alone with what the silence tells us. This is true of the interactions between Chani and Paul too. Is she angered because he foolishly risked his life? Or is she angered by the realization of Paul's manipulation of her? Whilst facing Feyd-Rautha, there's this beautiful scene where the two just stare at each other. Paul's face betrays this incredible, inscrutable tragedy. Is his tragedy knowing he must choose between his need for power and his love of her? Is his tragedy his knowledge of the future, trapped on a path that he now must see through? Is his tragedy in knowing what he has had to become and what she sees him as now? And Chani's face conveys this deep conflict. Is she letting go of her love for him now, aware of his true nature? Is she pained by knowing she must act against him regardless of her love? Is she angered by the stark realization of the depths of his manipulation? Even in this final scene with Chani, we're simply left to ponder her final motivations. Does she feel pain due to Paul discarding her to marry Princess Irulan? Is she saddened by her inevitable isolation from her people? Or is she just remorseful for her people's future and determined to act to prevent their massacre? Denis leaves us to come to our own truths, probe our own perceptions, and form our own conclusions. It demonstrates the sheer respect Denis has for his audience. He has faith that we as viewers will rewatch, review, and reconsider, rather than just mindlessly consume. In today's media landscape, where exposition saturates every scene,
Young Solo.
I killed Han Solo. When the moment came, I didn't hesitate.
And look at you. The deed split your spirit to the bone. You were unbalanced, bested by a girl who had never held a lightsaber.
where characters articulate their every thought,
I feel the conflict in you. It's tearing you apart.
and where every event is spelled out.
Cannon's opening, this is our chance!
Dune stands as a testament to the power of silence and dialogue. What Dune accomplishes in cinematography is an astronomical achievement. Every frame is uncluttered, uncrowded, and devoid of unnecessary noise. Greg Fraser, the mastermind responsible for this visual marvel, brings the same unparalleled expertise from his Oscar-winning work on the first installment. Fraser's approach to crafting the world of Dune is rooted in quiet minimalism, focusing on three key characteristics: physicality, intimacy, and discrete stylization. The world of Dune possesses a verisimilitude unmatched by anything else in the entirety of sci-fi. How does Fraser achieve this degree of palpable physicality? The answer lies in Fraser's core philosophy when it came to shooting Dune. Intervening as little as possible with the natural setting, the lighting as a result is entirely real. Dune Part 2 had to be shot in 24 locations in order to get the ideal lighting conditions. Shooting in the Wadi Rum Desert and Liwa Oasis meant visible light was often obstructed. Trenches and shooting areas had to be intensively mapped out by the crew. Whole sequences of the movie had to be rendered out in Unreal Engine, just to determine the exact time of day when the sun would be positioned to reproduce the desired cinematography. The final result is something that couldn't be replicated with post-processing. There are just subtle beauties to light that cannot be duplicated by hardware. Another factor is the novel mastering Dune utilizes. Dune was shot digital, then scanned to film print, and then scanned back to a digital print. A completely novel approach using technology called Shift AI by Photochem. This technology has only been used in one film outside of Dune, and that was remarkably by Fraser, who used the same technology on Matt Reeves' The Batman. The final look gives a physicality to the mix of Dune's CGI and real environment. What minimal effects that are present blend so transparently because scanning to film produces texture that makes the VFX look baked in to the original film footage. Another key choice in these shots is the deliberate use of vintage lenses. Despite Dune being filmed on high-end Alexa 65 cameras, Fraser made the conscious choice to use older lenses, specifically retro Soviet Helios 44 lenses. When you see close-ups in Dune, principally amongst the Fremen, you can see a considerable bokeh effect, which was an intentional choice to lower the fidelity produced in the high-end equipment to better suit the grit of Arrakis. The camera work plays a key role in facilitating this too. Every shot seems composed in the cleanest manner, no extravagant maneuvers, no intense camera shake. Because the camera never acts in an unnatural manner, it better replicates the feel of a real space being captured. All of this runs counter to the conventional safe approach for such a big film. With access to so much technology, there's a courage to use so little of it. A true artist like Fraser could only emerge from such austerity with such elegance. Fraser has proven that all the technological innovations of film are still no match for the silent spectacle of the natural world. Fraser's approach to framing and composition has a profound sense of quietude, creating such an intense intimacy with the characters and world. Rarely does Fraser rely on more than a handful of elements in frame, even during heavy action scenes. The assault on the Spice Harvester by the Fremen has this very small Harkonnen patrol, and there is only one ornithopter as opposed to a whole fleet. Also, when Paul emerges from the other side of the harvester, the small group of Fremen fall away. The scene reduces, its sole focus becoming Chani and Paul. Similarly, despite the Harkonnens' huge military battalion being shown, we witness only a few ornithopters in the air and very minimal Harkonnen presence on the ground. And Raban's cowardly escape prioritizes only him and his ornithopter. In the final battle scene, rather than continue the fight in the wide shot, we narrow in on Chani's perspective. Keeping to this spirit, Fraser relies on very few wide or long shots. Limiting the elements like this presents the pure essence of a moment.
Look who's back from the dead.
Scenes become like single notes ringing out from a quiet spatial echo chamber. It's because of this that the final assault on Arrakeen feels so monumental and huge. Because it emerges from such previously quiet composition. The use of vintage lenses by Fraser also works to bolster this quality, the heavy depth of field effectively narrowing the viewer's attention. The frame depicts the element in isolation amidst a quiet frame, typically centered and symmetrical. This scene when Paul makes his way through the giant crowd of Fremen illustrates this extremely well. Notice how, as each face enters into frame, the camera targets one person at a time. Light and shadow are also adeptly used by Fraser to enhance intimacy. Fraser silences the periphery of scenes using shadow, and then by using strong light and silhouetting refocuses and heightens our attention. This powerful intimacy in every moment of Dune through clear composition, limited lighting and focused framing manages the exceptional. It makes us feel placed in the world of Dune, deeply connected to every moment. Stripping down composition in the manner Fraser has done is such a rarity when so much of modern cinema tries to compete to produce the loudest possible compositions. Cluttering the frame with as many elements as possible. Fraser utilizes unique cinematography styles for the Fremen and Harkonnen that achieve not just aesthetic, but artistic exceptionalism. Distinct lighting, composition, color, fashioned by Fraser to delineate the divide between the two major factions. Fraser uses colour to petition in such a potently effective manner. The Fremen are identified by tan, ochre and amber hues, the Harkonnens black and white. The Harkonnens stand out starkly against the background of the desert, a representation of their inharmonious nature, whereas the Fremen are made to appear blended with the desert, reflecting how in contrast they are one with the deserts of Arrakis. The Harkonnens all seem to be a big, homogenized mass, identical featureless clones, a representation of their regimented authoritarian society. The Fremen have different skin tones and ethnicities, representing their individuation and diversity due to a freer society. And the whites of the Harkonnens make them appear like terrifying spectres ominously seeping out of the dark space they otherwise occupy. The muted earthy colour of the Fremen, on the other hand, becomes so ingrained that when we first see the ephemeral eyes of the Reverend Mother, they reach out with magnifying mysticism. When the vial of the water of life appears, the blue of the poison has such a striking splendour to it, piercing through the Fremen's lacklustre tones. The most compelling and stunning example of this colour distinction, though, happens with the absolutely breathtaking use of infrared in these scenes on Gaidi Prime. Fraser's contrast between palettes in combination with the minimalist background colours fashion a supreme polish to each frame, and in doing so has fashioned Dune into an aesthetic monolith. Fraser maintains a quiet palette choice relying on no extreme, rather than painting erratically and noisily. Fraser masterfully manipulates the stillness he constructs in his compositions, shifting spatial volume between the depictions of the Harkonnen and Fremen. A reliance on close-ups that solo frame the Fremen, crafting a singular feel to the Fremen's military might, contrasted with the Harkonnens where Fraser employs more medium and wide shots. These shots emphasize the Harkonnen supremacy in scale and numbers, whilst connoting distance and detachment. Fraser also compositionally communicates a greater divide and loneliness for the Harkonnens. Here, Feyd-Rautha seems like a lost soul in these metallic rooms. In the arena, there is this immense gulf between Feyd-Rautha and Baron Harkonnen, who is loftily positioned atop an impossibly monstrous tower block. Similarly, when Feyd-Rautha enters the Baron's chambers after his victory, he stands so far outside the Duke's vicinity, whereas the Fremen are composed in frame with one another. In the Siege to Bar, we see crowds of Fremen in huge social clusters. In this tent, the claustrophobically compact composition conveys a tight union between all the Fremen. And in the assembly chamber, when Paul makes his speech, everyone remains shoulder to shoulder, no gap, no divide between one another. All of this reflects their social wealth in opposition to the Harkonnens' social austerity. It's Fraser's meticulous attention to these quiet spatial dynamics that deeply imbues us with an almost telepathic understanding of Dune's social divides. Fraser adeptly shapes lighting with profound elegance. Whole scenes are compassed often in so much black that everything becomes silenced by shadow, choosing to allow a single glimmer to ring out. Fraser paints the Harkonnens in darkness, sharply silhouetted, mirroring their bleak and muted reality. In this map room, Raban and the other Harkonnen seem to be in complete shadow despite the bright blue light supplied by the Solido console. When the Harkonnens are leaving for battle, this army regiment is completely entrenched in blackness despite it being dusk on Arrakis. Even when entering the Ornithopter, the interior is oppressively smothered in shadow. The corridor in this scene with Lady Margot is completely pitch black, the fireworks providing only mere flutterings of light. Shish Akli sits in a pool of light, while all of the Harkonnen soldiers remain stationed around its perimeter. To the Fremen, the full force of Arrakis' sun bears down on them, illuminating all, revealing everything, reflecting the clarity of their simple lives, no exploitations, nothing to hide. Through this interplay of light and shadow, the subdivision between the Harkonnens and the Fremen is formed into a tapestry of illumination that voicelessly reveals everything. There's a huge problem at the core of this stylization. Despite the effective unison of these techniques to achieve this stark, potent richness in cinematography, it all just seems so grossly simple. The harsh black colouring, distant cold composition, and dark shadowed lighting too on the nose. But the transcendent final act of Dune utterly destroys all of those consternations, where the utility of this simple divide constructed through muted tools evolves to form something far more colossal. All these rules are turned on their heads when Paul awakens as the Kwisatz Haderach. Now instead we see Paul entrenched in darkness. In the mind space he shares with his mother, he sits, an isolated figure in a sea of black. He strides across the plain, a shadowy cloaked figure with a black sandworm bursting out from the dunes behind him. As he emerges from the crowd, he is rendered in harsh depth of field, no longer discernible. He makes his speech in the assembly chamber while standing in a center dais completely encased in shadow. Even emerging on this rock plateau in the full day of Arrakis, no light surrounds him. Ascending the steps to execute Baron Harkonnen, he emerges from a smokescreen of black. As he makes his killing blow, he is enveloped in darkness. And in his final fight, he is harshly silhouetted in shadow, just the same as Feyd-Rautha. Another key shift is Paul is no longer shown in line with the Fremen. Now he stands at a distance, someone out of reach, just as Baron Harkonnen was depicted. Paul never again coexists in the same frame as Chani. The clear intentionality of this can be seen when the Emperor enters the chamber and Paul turns around to reveal his identity. But immediately as his face is going to be shown alongside Charlie's, the scene cuts to him emerging from the right side of this next frame. The Fremen now emerge coloured in dark amber as though blended with the Harkonnen black. The Fremen also appear homogenized, indistinguishable from one another. Just as the Harkonnen soldiers were black and white replicas, the Fremen are now amber clones. All of this a reflection of the now indistinct moral separation between the two sides. The Fremen are now painted in the same harsh darkness previously occupied by the Harkonnens, symbolizing the now dark prospect of their people's future. The accomplishment of this coalescence in stylization is staggering. Symbolically and visually, it conveys so gracefully more ambiguity central to Dune's themes in a way no single word ever could. Fraser's simple subdivide used to illustrate the simple lines we draw between good and evil. The Harkonnen conveyed purposefully as this clear representation of evil. Paul, on the other hand, is clearly our earthly savior. A figure of light, a person of the people, the hero of our story. Yet everything quietly communicated to us in the cinematography uncomfortably conveys the opposite. He does not stand with the Fremen, he does not seem to walk in the light. In this, we are whispered a silent truth. Beware what walks in the brightest light, as it can cast the darkest shadow. Robert Bresson is considered the godfather of minimalist film. In his renowned work, Notes on a Cinematographer, Bresson articulates that movies fall into two distinct categories: film and cinema. Bresson said that films that simply capture actors, events, and settings were nothing more than theatre. Whereas the second category, cinema, utilised the art of cinematography to transform what was captured. The camera not just there to capture life, it created new life.
Je crois que le cinéma, la radio, la télévision tuent les arts. Mais je crois aussi en quelque chose de curieux, c'est que c'est peut-être justement par le cinématographe, la radio et la télévision que ces arts renaîtront.
Dune radically realizes Bresson's vision of film as a silent art form, built up with the intention of creating images and representing sounds in a way to form a final, quiet masterpiece.